I love NBA history. And because I love NBA history, I want to explore it as deeply as possible and make sure that we depict it as accurately as possible. And today, that's what we're going to be doing, looking back at the most controversial MVP races from 1995 to 2003, explaining why the wrong decision was made or why the right guy will remain as the winner from that season. Now, before we begin, let's briefly establish what criteria should matter most when we're determining who the MVP actually is from a given season. If you want a deeper explanation of some of these precedents, you can go back and check out part 1 of this series where I touched on the most controversial MVPs from 2005 to present day and went into more detail with all these explanations, but we'll keep it briefer here since I've already explained it elsewhere. Winning is a huge precedent for the reasons you see here. Since 1983, only 2 players who didn't finish as a top 2 seed have won MVP, and from 1983 to 2016, the average MVP won over 62 games. Basically, you have to have an elite team first to get through the door as a candidate. Second precedent, efficiency. 47 straight MVPs have been at or above league average true shooting percentage, and 42 of those 47 have been 3% or more better than league average. If you're inefficient, you aren't maximizing the finite opportunities you're afforded within a given game, which makes it harder to drive winning at the highest level. And third, narrative doesn't matter. Don't care about it. Give me the best guy, not the best story. With that out of the way, we've got 5 MVP races to tackle today from a 7-year span, which is insane, but this was just an era filled with controversial MVP races. So today, we'll be working our way backwards, starting with 2003. Now, on part 1 of this series, I said I thought the 2006 MVP race was the closest ever, but man, 2003 makes a compelling case as well. This was the second of back-to-back Duncan MVPs, and we'll touch on the first one in just a bit, but this one was, in my opinion, much closer. Duncan's competition this year was also one of his greatest rivals for over a decade in Kevin Garnett, who pushed pretty hard for the award, earning 43 first-place MVP votes to Duncan's 60. Garnett's production this year was very similar to that of his nearly unanimous MVP the following season. The biggest difference is that in 2004, the T-Wolves won 58 games and grabbed the 1 seed, while in 2003, they racked up 51 wins in the 4 seed. As we've established, that's not a gap that can simply be dismissed when it comes to the MVP race, but it's also very important to note that the T-Wolves added both Sam Cassell and Latrell Sprewell for the 2003-04 season, putting a significantly bolstered core around KG as compared to what they had in 2002-03. So now, let's look back specifically at that 2002-03 season. KG was a special player at this point in his career, averaging 23 points, 13.5 rebounds, and 6 assists per game. He could initiate offense from the perimeter as one of the quickest bigs in basketball with a legitimate pull-up jumper, which also made him a constant threat facing up. As a passer, he was a hub both from the perimeter and out of the post, with a fundamentally unselfish approach and the ability to whip passes all around the court. Defensively, he was one of the best lateral movers and smartest, most instinctual big man the league has ever seen, with lightning quick hands and a 7'5" wingspan that allowed him to gobble up rebounds and affect shots from everywhere. If you were going to nitpick his game, you could argue KG was never an elite offensive centerpiece. At just 220 pounds, he was never able to physically dominate out of the post, making him somewhat reliant on those tough jumpers, and he never had the point guard who could maximize his value out of pick and roll or pick and pop situations, which also would have been aided by a heavier use of the 3-point shot in a different era. Still, he was an efficient scorer and high-level playmaker as by far the best player on a top 5 offense in basketball with very limited help around him, so it's tough to really criticize his value there. KG was really everything for this team. He led them comfortably in points, rebounds, assists, steals, and blocks, and carried a real ragtag crew to the league's 4th best record. Here are the 4 players who started the most games alongside KG this season: Wally Szczerbiak, Rasho Nesterovic, Anthony Peeler, and Troy Hudson. Now, making that even more brutal, Szczerbiak, by far the team's 2nd best player, missed 30 games on the year. In games he did play, the Timberwolves were 35-17, putting them on a 55-win pace. Now, if his tremendous versatility and ability to carry that crew doesn't make Garnett's impact on winning clear enough, hopefully this will. With KG on the floor this year, the T-Wolves outscored opponents by a differential equivalent to that of a top 3 team in the NBA. Without him, they got outscored by 17 points per 100 possessions, making them a couple points worse than the 2012 Bobcats, the team with the worst record of all time. That means they were 23.6 points per 100 better with KG on the floor than without him. For context, here are the best on-off splits of basically every great player since the stat began being tracked in 1996. Garnett's from this season are, as you can see, the best out of this entire group. And how about this to make his impact even clearer? 3 of the 4 players who started alongside KG had negative on-off splits, showing that besides Szczerbiak, there was not a single other player on this roster who impacted winning at all. You could pair KG with just about anybody, and the T-Wolves would be really good, and you could leave any group of the rest of the crew alone without KG, and you'd have a disaster. So the T-Wolves weren't a top 2 seed, as is typically required if you're gunning for that MVP trophy, but I would argue this is up there for the single greatest floor-raising season in NBA history, so we have to consider Garnett very hard here. Now, here's what complicates all this. Duncan had a fantastic season as well, and put a nice bow on it with one of the greatest postseasons of all time also, if you remember that, although that doesn't factor into the discussion here. Timmy averaged 23, 13, and 4 on slightly better efficiency than KG, and may not have been as versatile of an offensive weapon as KG, but excelled at what he did as a masterful post scorer. Defensively, it was the same deal. Maybe KG could guard all 5 better than Timmy, but Duncan protected the hell out of the rim, blocking 2.9 shots per game to lead San Antonio's top 3 defense. Also, by the standards of a 60-win team, the Spurs roster wasn't exactly star-studded. Defensively, they were stout, with Steven Jackson and Bruce Bowen on the wings, but neither player made a significant contribution offensively. At 37 years old, David Robinson was still a really good defensive player, but was basically a role guy, averaging 8 and 8, and Tony Parker, at 20 years old, was the team's clear number 2 guy, scoring just 15.5 points per game. They also had a couple quality bench guys in Malik Rose and rookie Manu Ginobili, who averaged 7.6 points per game. Now, that group is still a hell of a lot deeper with quality talent than the T-Wolves, who again, had 2 good players basically, but you also need to remember that KG has a 9-win gap to make up here, so it's not like you'd expect the supporting cast to be exactly dead even. And Duncan's impact on team success was immense too. The Spurs outscored opponents by 9.1 points per 100 with him out there, and were 14.7 points better with him on the floor than off it, a mark that's not on KG's level, but is still pretty massive. So they both have their cases. KG is the remarkable, do-it-all floor raiser, and Duncan as the clear two-way centerpiece and lone star on an elite team. We can try to separate the two by skill set, but it still brings us close to a draw. I give Duncan a slight scoring edge, would say playmaking goes to KG, and although defense is crazy close, I lean Duncan just because his rim protection was probably more singularly impactful than KG's versatility, given the importance of taking away the paint, particularly in this clustered time in NBA history. I think KG was better suited to carry a team with nothing around him as the man who could do just about everything at a high level, but I think Duncan could arguably integrate more easily into a really good team as that dominant post force. Much like Nash versus Dirk in 06, this one is going to keep me up at night, but I think I ultimately have to go with the precedent as a tiebreaker, and that says we should go with Duncan. Given the emphasis we've placed on MVPs finishing as a top 2 seed, we've established the precedent that elevating a solid core to being the best team in the league, as Duncan did, is more valuable than elevating a terrible core to being good. Now, KG really stretches that standard by carrying the Timberwolves to 50+ wins given what he had to overcome, so you'll hear no complaints from me if he's your guy, but I'm going to go with Duncan just barely here. Shout out to Dirk as a really solid third candidate from this season too, but we spent enough time on this race as is, and I think his lack of a two-way impact keeps him from getting deep into the discussion here. But man, what a time for power forwards this was. So finally, Timmy D keeps his hardware from 03. Now, let's take the clock back 1 year earlier to 02. I'll address this one just because the vote was very close in real time, with Duncan earning 57 first place votes to Jason Kidd's 45, and because many people think it's controversial. Personally, I don't, but let's get into it anyways. Kidd's case in 2002 has, on its face, a lot of similarities to Nash's in 05, who I said in the last video I believe deserved to keep his MVP. Kidd took the Nets from 26 wins the year before he got there to 52 in 02, and literally replaced Stephon Marbury, as Nash did, on a team that's only other significant roster changes were getting Kerry Kittles back from injury and adding a rookie Richard Jefferson. The major difference, though, is that while Nash pioneered the Suns' all-time great offense, the Nets were still just 17th in offensive rating with Kidd and took their leap as a team largely because they went from the league's 23rd best defense the year before he got there to the best in the league in his first season. Now, did Kidd contribute to that defensive leap? Of course, he was a phenomenal defender and first-team all-defense this year, but no individual perimeter defender has that kind of impact on team defense. The Suns also won 62 games versus the Nets 52, a major gap when it comes to one's MVP case, although the Nets were a mind-blowing 17.6 points per 100 possessions better with Kidd out there than when he wasn't out there. And what's crazy is they were only 2.4 points per 100 better than opponents when he did play, meaning they were basically the 2012 Bobcats without him. Regardless, they were never an elite regular season team despite finishing as the top seed in the weakest Eastern Conference ever, and not only did Kidd never come close to Nash's brilliant efficiency as a scorer, he would have posted the worst true shooting percentage of any MVP since Dave Cowens in 1973 at 48.4%, nearly 4 points below league average. Yes, Kidd was a brilliant passer and defender and had a phenomenal season, but he shot 39% from the field and just misses out on so much of the criteria that we generally value when it comes to the MVP race. Meanwhile, Duncan was the best two-way player in basketball for the 58-win Spurs, operating as an efficient centerpiece for the team's top 10 offense, where he averaged a career-high 25.5 points per game, and an outstanding rim protector on the other end, where the Spurs were second as a team and he averaged 2.5 blocks per game, earning first-team all-defense honors. This team also had no business winning 58 games. Their second-best player was probably 36-year-old David Robinson, who averages 12 points per game, and they were without contributors to the 03 title run like Steven Jackson and Manu Ginobili, while Tony Parker averages 9 points per game at 19 years old. Carrying that team to 58 wins is crazy. The Spurs were also a whopping 9.5 points per 100 better with Duncan on the floor, going from elite with him on it to outscored with him off it. Ultimately, Duncan was the best player in the world at this point, while Kidd makes a floor raiser case that isn't even as compelling as some of the ones that we looked at last time, or nearly as compelling as what we talked about just moments ago with KG. This was a great season for Kidd, no doubt, but without the narrative of him being the new guy in town, he wouldn't have come close. Just look at the next season's voting for evidence of that, when Kidd scored 4 more points per game, more efficiently for a team that won just 3 less games, and he finished 8th in MVP voting. Duncan keeps this one easily. Time to turn back to the previous century. The 1998-99 season gave us one of the weirdest, weakest, but tightest MVP races of all time that was at the end of the day really interesting. Remember that we're also looking at a lockout-shortened 50-game season here, which just makes everything even more strange. As far as the candidates, you have a 35-year-old Karl Malone, past his prime and averaging his least points per game in over a decade, a 22-year-old Duncan, only in his second season and not yet at his apex, and a 28-year-old Alonzo Mourning, who was the best he ever was at this point, but is also obviously not of the same caliber as an all-time player as Malone or Duncan. All 3 players were first-team all-defense big men, but none of them scored even 24 points per game. This was a slow, defensively focused, grinded-out, big man-dominated era of basketball in a transitional period between the dynasty of the 90s and Michael Jordan and the great teams of the 2000s and the Kobe Shaq era, and this MVP race very much reflects that. The voting was absurdly close, too. Malone finished with 44 first-place votes and his second MVP in 3 seasons, while Mourning wasn't far behind at 36 first-place votes, and Duncan finished with 30. So now that the scene is set, let's start with the actual winner this year, Malone. Honestly, this was, in a lot of ways, a down year by Malone's standards. He shot the worst percentage from the field of his career at this point, averaged his least rebounds per game since his rookie season, averaged more turnovers per game than he had in nearly a decade, and, as I said earlier, averaged his least points per game in 12 years. Now, it's important to keep in mind that Carl had set a pretty high standard for all those numbers and was still able to score at a highly efficient level due to his brilliant interior scoring game and otherworldly ability to draw fouls, while he was an above-average playmaker out of the post, a first-team all-defense selection, and the best player on a Jazz team that racked up 37 wins, tied for the most in basketball. Now, despite Malone's greatness, the Jazz this year were really a great team. 4 of their 5 starters posted a true shooting percentage of 57 or above, making the majority of the group on par with Malone's efficiency, and Malone's on-court net rating, meaning how much the Jazz outperformed opponents by with him on the court, ranked just 4th out of the team's 5 starters, which just shows that the entire unit was dominant more than any one individual was. A logical conclusion for a team with an elite floor general like Stockton, who was past his prime but still 3rd-team All-NBA, and a versatile scoring weapon and secondary playmaker like Hornacek. Malone's defensive impact also pales in comparison to the other 2 candidates, as he was stout there, but offered no real value as a rim protector, where he averaged just 0.6 blocks per game, which is always the most valuable thing you can do as a big man defensively. Personally, I think Malone got this award on reputation. He was the best offensive player out of this trio, but was far from a one-man engine there, had the most help and the least defensive impact. He was by far the most established of the 3 candidates, so he got the benefit of the doubt in a really weird year, but I think he had the weakest case. Now, let's go from the old guy to the legend in the making. This version of Duncan, at just 22 years old, was a phenomenal player, a transcendent defender and high-level scorer, capable of being the best player on a title team that finished with a 37-13 regular season record, tied with the Jazz for the best in basketball, but he wasn't quite in his fully evolved form just yet in his second season. Duncan averaged just under 22 points per game this year on good efficiency, but wasn't overly efficient by his standards and lacked the ability to dominate a game as a scorer that he would develop in the coming seasons. He was also pretty limited as a playmaker at this point. Still, he was dominant defensively, averaging 2.5 blocks per game for the Spurs' league's best defense, but I'd say the Spurs' success on that end is also inseparable from David Robinson, who was nowhere near his peak self but was still a very good star-level player with a massive defensive impact. At this point, Robinson was in between All-NBA seasons and finished 12th in MVP voting this year, averaging 16 and 10 efficiently, while operating as an agile, smart defensive weapon and one of the league's best rim protectors, putting up 1.4 steals per game and 2.4 blocks per game. Ultimately, the Spurs were an elite team because of their defense, as they were just slightly above average offensively, and that defensive brilliance was as much about Robinson as it was about Duncan. Interestingly, the Spurs were actually better with Robinson on the floor than they were with Duncan this year, and while personally I think these are all bad stats, if you're a fan of them, Robinson led the league in win shares per 38, defensive box plus minus, and defensive rating this season. Generally, the Spurs were just a really good team with or without Duncan. They outscored opponents by 6.4 points per 100 when he was off the floor, a mark that would be better than all but two non-Spurs teams in the NBA, and they were only 4.2 points per 100 better with him on the floor than off it, a far below average mark for an MVP. While we saw Duncan carry some Spurs teams later in his tenure, like in 02 and 03, that was not the case this year. He had a real second star alongside him, and that matters. Now let's talk about Zoe. Mourning would be one of the weaker offensive players to ever win MVP, with a healthy gap still between him and Wes Unseld, who currently holds that title, but he was a very good scorer. For reference, Mourning's 20.1 points per game this year accounted for 22.6% of his team's total points. That's a higher percentage than Kawhi Leonard this season, who's averaging 25.7 points per game. That gives important context, because in '99, the Heat played at the slowest pace of any team in the single slowest year in league history, so his scoring numbers are more impressive than the raw output might let on. Offensively, he had his limitations. Notably, he was a completely subpar passer, averaging just 1.6 assists per game, which limited his ability to elevate the guys around him and be a one-man offensive engine, but he blended skill and power at a high level out of the post, was a respectable jump shooter, and got to the line at an absurd clip. But really, Mourning's case is certainly not predicated on his offense. Defensively, he was probably the most impactful player in the league, winning DPOY both this season and the following one. It's interesting to look back on Mourning's defense. He certainly wasn't as light on his feet as you would want a big man to be today, but that wasn't nearly as problematic when switching and perimeter shooting were so much less important, and he was an eraser around the rim, averaging a whopping 3.9 blocks per game, the highest mark in the NBA. At 6'10", 240, Mourning had a sturdy base that made him impossible to bully down low, and a 7'6" wingspan that allowed him to affect shots from all over and act as a constant deterrent to anyone bold enough to enter his paint. Because of that value as a rim protector, Mourning single-handedly drove the Heat to be an elite team defense, a fact that is made very apparent by how they performed in his absence. Get this, the Heat allowed 100 points in a game just 5 times all season. 3 of those games came without Zoe, who missed just 4 games on the entire year. In games he played, the Heat had the number 6 defense in basketball. In games he missed, they had the worst defense in the entire NBA. In games Zoe played, the Heat allowed 82.9 points per game. Without him, they allowed 96.3. Now, of course, 4 games without him is a very small sample size, but here's the craziest part. In those 4 games that Zoe didn't play, they faced the 20th, 25th, 26th, and 29th ranked offenses in basketball. Keep in mind there were only 29 teams in the NBA at this point, and they got lit up. They allowed more points to the Chicago Bulls, the 3rd worst offense of all time, without Zoe than they did in all but 1 of 46 games that Zoe did play. And really, Mourning's supporting cast was just less than shiny overall. The names certainly sound good: Tim Hardaway, Jamal Mashburn, Terry Porter, Dan Marley, but Porter and Marley were well past their primes, with Porter coming off the bench and Marley averaging just 7 points per game, and Mashburn missed over half the team's games. Hardaway was also past his best years at 32, averaging 17 and 7 on league average efficiency. So, Mourning led the Heat to a 32-14 record when he played, versus the 1-3 they went without him, with one fringe star level teammate in Tim Hardaway and PJ Brown as their 3rd best guy. The Heat were also an incomprehensible 18 points per 100 better with Mourning on the floor than off it, marking the difference between the league's best team when he was on the floor and a bottom 5 club without him. That mark is also about 3 times better than his second closest teammate, just showing how directly related their success really was to Zoe's dominance. So, which team was not only the best of the bunch with their MVP candidate on the floor, but the worst with him off it, showing how dependent they really were on him? The Heat. And which player single-handedly transformed his team on one side of the ball? Zoe. At the end of the day, we haven't seen many players win MVP on the back of defense before, although there have been the Bill Russells, Wes Unselds, and Bill Waltons, but the '99 race gives us some exceptional circumstances. Zoe's offensive production isn't far behind the other leading candidates at all, and he was still without question the best offensive player on a top 8 offense, while none of these guys were true offensive engines out of the post. In this season, truly great offense was next to impossible to find, and defense really was king. Just look at who got to the finals. It was the Spurs with the league's number 1 defense, and the Knicks with a top 4 defense and bottom 4 offense. What we have in today's NBA, with guys who are walking elite team offenses, Zoe was on the defensive end. In a lot of ways, he's a perfect embodiment of what mattered most in basketball this season. Is it weird to think about Alonzo Mourning, who was only All-NBA twice in his entire career, as an MVP over guys like Malone and Duncan? Absolutely, but let's face it, this MVP race just sucked, and one guy was at the peak of his powers while the other 2 weren't. Who would I have taken for the playoffs? I'd say Duncan, and I think the postseason results showed why that's the case, but who do I believe had the better regular season? I think it was Alonzo Mourning. Alright, so now we get to the 1996-97 MVP race. We're going to talk about 97-98 too, but I think it makes sense to start with 97 first since both of these races involve the same two characters. Now, Malone and Jordan both came away with one MVP from this era. Malone won in 97 and Jordan won in 98, but I believe the 97 race was the textbook example of narrative getting in the way and leading us to the wrong result. People were tired of Jordan winning MVPs. Malone had been great for a decade plus and was currently playing for his best team yet, so they gave it to the wrong guy. First, let's look at Jordan's case this year. As usual, he led the league in scoring, outpacing second place Malone by over 2 points per game, scored efficiently, racked up first team all defense honors, and led the Bulls to a 69-13 record, tied for the second best mark in NBA history at the time, while leading them to the league's best offense, which was the 11th best in league history at the time. Not only was Jordan efficient by true shooting percentage, but he boosted his efficiency as an overall player by turning the ball over just 2 times per game, making him the only player in NBA history to score as much as he did and turn the ball over that little in a single season. Additionally, the Bulls managed this all-time success despite a number of injuries to some of their best players. Dennis Rodman missed 27 games. The Bulls went 21-6 without him. Tony Kukoc missed 25 games. The Bulls went 19-6 without him. Starting center Luke Longley missed 23 games, and the Bulls went 20-3 without him. And to be clear, they did this in spite of the fact that this was not a deep team. 23-year-old Jason Caffey, who would be traded by the next season, was the team's second man off the bench, and the roster was severely lacking for offensive punch, with starters like Rodman and Ron Harper offering tremendous defensive value, but scoring just about 6 points per game offensively. But the Bulls were an all-time offense because of Jordan. With less of the otherworldly athleticism and at-rim finishing of his youth at his disposal, Jordan thrived as a master of skill, shooting a blistering 49% from mid-range and taking advantage of the shorted three-point line this season, knocking down better than 37% of his nearly 4 attempts per game from deep. He still collapsed defenses like it was nothing, attracted second defenders often, and had massive gravity, all components in his tremendous impact on team offense, even with lower assist numbers than in previous seasons. Malone had a great season too, averaging 27, 10, and 4.5 for the 64-win Jazz, while earning first-team all-defense honors. That's great production, but it certainly doesn't compare to the historical significance of Jordan carrying that team to all-time heights amidst so much adversity. To me, the only conceivable argument in Malone's favor would be that he was moderately more efficient as a scorer, posting a true shooting percentage 3% above Jordan's, and that he posted absurd on-off splits, as the Jazz were 21.9 points per 100 better with him on the floor than off it, but that's really just a reflection of the strength of the Jazz's entire starting five as compared to its bench, as the team's net rating with Malone on the floor was just the 4th best out of their starting group, the same as it was in '99. To give some more context to that, Utah's insanely efficient offense really was a collective effort. 4 of the team's 5 starters ranked among the league's 15 most efficient scorers by true shooting percentage, and they shot over 50% from the field as a team, 2.5% better than the league's second-place team. Malone was a phenomenal offensive player, but he was never able to single-handedly elevate an offense to elite status by himself, whereas Jordan was a walking elite team offense. Malone needed his Stockton, a hyper-efficient, uber-intelligent floor general, and he needed his Hornacek, one of the best off-ball weapons and pure shooters of all time, who could elevate any team offense. In fact, for the first 8 years of the Stockton-Malone partnership before Hornacek got there, the Jazz's average ranking and offensive rating was 13th. Then, in their first 4 full years with Hornacek, they had 4 straight top 3 offenses, having never had a single top 3 offense previously. Jordan, meanwhile, never played for an offense rated 13th or lower in his entire career, whether his second leading man was Orlando Woolridge, Charles Oakley, or Scottie Pippen. He was a great offense. Malone was part of one. Really, we didn't need to overcomplicate this race. The undisputed best player in basketball led a team to 69 wins with a supporting cast that probably wasn't as strong as his primary competitor, was a superior offensive engine, and a more impactful defender as well. Just give the award to that guy and move on. Now, the 98 MVP race, which Jordan came out on top of and actually wasn't that close in real time, with Jordan earning 92 first-place votes to Malone's 20, is a lot more interesting. This year, Malone again averaged 27, 10, and 4 on 60% true shooting for a team that was 17.4 points per 100 better with him on the floor and won 62 games. Jordan, meanwhile, averaged 28.7 points per game, the lowest of any season in which he played at least 20 games since his rookie year, on 46.5% shooting from the field and 53.3% true shooting, both the lowest of his whole career by a considerable amount, while he averaged 3.5 assists per game, the lowest of his career as well. Still, the Bulls won 62 games, and at 34, Jordan remained the best player in the world, push come to shove, but the margin was slimmer than ever. This season also presented an interesting challenge to Jordan because, as you may recall if you watched The Last Dance, Scottie missed 40 games with injury, and the Bulls went a very impressive 26-14 in those games. With Scottie, they were a ridiculous 36-6, showing that they really hadn't taken a step back at all from the year prior with him out there. Interestingly, Malone also had to manage a world without Stockton for the first time in his career, as the ultimate Iron Man, who missed just 4 possible games in his 19-year career outside of this season, missed 18 games. In those games without Stockton, the Jazz fared okay, going 11-7. Both players performed better with their co-stars alongside them, with Jordan taking a more notable jump in efficiency, while Malone's jump was in raw production, which I do think is telling because Malone was more dependent on Stockton to set up that offense. Ultimately, I think this is Malone's MVP. The Jazz were better with him on the floor than the Bulls were with Jordan, their raw production was almost identical, and both players earned first-team all-defense honors. But Malone was far more efficient. This year, Jordan scored at barely above league average efficiency, which, as we discussed at the beginning, is normally a disqualifier in the MVP discussion, and had the second lowest true shooting percentage of any MVP season since 1973. Malone, meanwhile, scored at elite efficiency. Call that a tiebreaker that makes breaking the tie pretty easy. If not for some media mental gymnastics in the 97 season that made everybody think Malone had to win that season, I think we could and should have seen Jordan win in 97 and Malone win in 98. And in a world where I'm omnipotent, that's what happens. So after all of this, here are your updated MVP counts. Duncan keeps his MVPs from both 02 and 03. Jordan swaps 97 and 98 with Malone, but stays at 5 total. Malone loses his 99 MVP to move down to just 1 in total, and Alonzo Mourning gains an MVP to his trophy case. NBA history is on its way to being fixed, but we're not all the way there. I've still got plenty more deserved MVPs I want to reward in my head, so we'll continue this journey soon enough. To those of you who have made it this far, thank you so much for watching. As always, I hope you've enjoyed. If you want more content like this, stick around on our YouTube channel, check out some of the other stuff that we've done. We do a lot of player breakdowns. I did one pretty recently on why Jason Tatum has an all-time ceiling and what he has to do to ultimately reach that you can go check out. You can also check out our podcast, Nerd Sesh, which we do 3 times a week. On Monday, we talk about some sports history topic in the NBA or NFL. So if you enjoyed this, we've got more sports history content. And then the other 2 shows of the week, we talk about the NBA now that we're in season, and we talk about the NFL when that is in season as well. You can also find more of our content on social media. Twitter is at nerd_sesh, and Instagram is at nerdsesh. And with that, as always, guys, thanks for watching. Hope you've enjoyed.